Hey, Steve Mignoni here at High Octane Classics in Auburn, Massachusetts with another high octane walk around, this time with a 1970 Pontiac GTO. Now, if you ask almost anybody, they'll tell you that the GTO in 1964 was the first muscle car. And what does muscle car mean? Well, a big engine in a mid-sized platform, which rules out cars like the Chrysler 300 of the 1950s, which were big cars with big engines. So again, by combining the 389 of the full-size Pontiac and the mid-sized A-body platform, the GTO was indeed the first muscle car. And again, one of the big things about GTO was the self-aware image of muscle. GTO did a great job of molding the sizzle as well as the steak. Now, the peak year for GTO production was 1966 with 96,946 GTOs, or the great ones, sold. By 1970, well, the party was winding down, and in total, only 40,149 GTOs were sold in 1970. In 71, about 11,000. So the party was kind of dying down. With that said, 1970, by many accounts, is the most attractive, or certainly one of the most attractives. Now, 69 and 68 had something called the Endura nose, which could be had with retractable headlights. For 1970, the Endura urethane nose remained. This is basically a steel structure with a flexible urethane coating that's baked on. It's not something that's painted. That's actually deep, about a half an inch or so in various spots. But the one thing that went away from 1970 was the optional retractable headlights. All 70 GTOs came with exposed headlights like this, with body-colored surrounds, and to some, a better look. You call it, which one you prefer. But again, the GTO's urethane nose was unique to the GTO. You couldn't get this face on a Le Mans or a Tempest or any other Pontiac. So that's the big thing about 1970. Another detail too, of course, is the existence of the awesome double bump hood right here, first seen in 68. And unless you had a ram air engine, these were blocked off. But again, no crime there. You look at the Plymouth Roadrunner of 1968, those scoops did nothing, but one thing they did well, sell cars. Now for another $25, you could get this, the hood-mounted tachometer, which made its first appearance in 1967. And this one here being a 1970, something that's kind of unique is 70 is the year that Pontiac remedied a problem. People sometimes would complain that humidity would build up inside of the housing and frost the lens from inside with moisture. You couldn't see it. So Pontiac, early in 1970, added a little tube going to the heater core that pumped a little bit of warm air into the scoop so it didn't frost up anymore. Kind of interesting. Now, of course, 1970, no more sedans. The Pillar Coupe GTO was a thing of the past, either convertible or hardtop, as we see here. Another detail, of course, for 1970 is a revised deck lid spoiler, standard on Judge, but optional on all GTOs. This one here, the wing stands tall on stanchions right in here. For 1969, there was an arrangement that came down. If you had your hand here and you slammed the trunk, you could whack your fingers, and it wasn't always fun. But at the back of the GTO, beautiful quad tips coming out the back, something new for 1970. We have here in the rear valance. And this one does wear the Judge logo, but again, this one's a true GTO, not a Judge, but that's okay. But on the side of this wing, something important and new for 1970 was this, the available 455. Now, previously, the 400 was as big as it got in a GTO, and of course, the 389. But for 1970, GM opened the floodgates and says, okay, any engines possible in the midsize, which brought the Chevelle SS 454, the Buick GS 455, Olds 442, 455, and of course, the available 455 in the Pontiac GTO. Let's look under the hood and see what we find. Now, unlike certain competing muscle cars, the Chevy full-size Super Sport Impala, you could actually get a 6-cylinder engine in a Super Sport Impala. Crazy. And even the Malibu in 64 and 65, you could actually get a 6-cylinder engine in a Super Sport Malibu. But in GTO land, you had nothing but V8s, which is fine by me. Yeah. Okay, this one here has some upgrades. And we can see the Pontiac iron engine block is below there. This one appears to be a 455. Big torque, the biggest Pontiac V8 of all time, bigger than the 428 or the 421. But this one has something even better. The aluminum Edelbrock Performer RPM cylinder heads, which have bigger ports and valves and flow much more air than pretty much any Pontiac ram air forehead. And of course, big tube steel headers right here to help the manifold, the engine exhale as well as it inhales. And speaking of inhaling, dual quads. And if you don't know, quad is a 4-barrel carburetor. It's slang for quad. Dual quads means 2 4-barrel carburetors sitting on an aluminum Edelbrock dual plane intake manifold. Now, you got to remember that dual quads are not something that Pontiac played with too much. In the Mopar world, yeah, the street Hemi, the Max Wedge, the race Hemi could be had with dual quads. Meanwhile, Buick had dual quads on their 425 Grand Sport Rivieras and cars like that. But dual quads in Pontiac land were last seen in 1963 on the 421 Super Duty Catalina. But again, you can bolt them onto anything and they work just fine. The beauty of the dual quads is these are Edelbrock 1404s, which means these are 500 CFM each, 1000 CFM, but the linkage is progressive, which means you drive around in a rear carburetor, right, like that, up to about 50, 60, just around town. But when you want to party, you whack it to the floor and the front carb comes to life. But that's called progressive linkage right there. So that's why 500 CFM gets you around town, but 1000 CFM gets you around that Roadrunner in the other lane. This one does have power disc brakes up front. And speaking of which, here's the booster here. And disc brakes were still not standard on GTO in 1970, crazy but true. But this one does have them. I believe it was a $70 option. And here they are inside, Delco Moraine, 11-inch diameter. Drums in the back, and again, plenty of stopping power for most any normal use. Aftermarket 17-inch American Racing torque thrust type wheels with modern radials to give this, sure-footed handling like no bias ply could ever deliver. Now let's look inside. One of the classic interiors of an American muscle car with bucket seats. Got to remember, back in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, bucket seats were just not seen in American cars except for Thunderbirds and Corvettes. But for 1962, buckets became the big deal and certainly were a major part of every muscle car interior, including the GTO. Now, these have been customized with orange piping to match the orange paint on the outside of the car. Adds a nice, distinct custom touch. It just does have the GTO's available automatic transmission. You got to keep in mind, base transmission in GTO was a 3-speed manual, and then there was a 4-speed possible, but this is the automatic, which, crazy but true, the L, S, and the D, those 3 letters were not missed by some of the hippies of the day, crazy but true, but now we know these stand for low, second, and drive. This is the Turbo 400, heavy-duty automatic, totally up to the task of moving this one down the road. Nicely done inside. The bucket seats do have head rests. We can see them right here. These would have been optional before January 1st, 1969. You'd paid a little extra for them. But as of January 1st of 69, the Fed said, hey, all bucket seats must have headrests, in fact, all seats, to prevent whiplash and spinal cord injuries. But they still look very cool, add a racy touch, and they're standard equipment. This one is just nicely presented inside, and it does have some Judge logos here. Now, the car is not a documented Judge, we know that, but it is a real GTO. And the way we can tell that is by looking at the VIN, which is up on the corner of the dashboard. We look at the 242 in the first 3 spots, and this is a real GTO. Let's now look in the trunk. And underneath this Judge spoiler, inside the trunk, we'll see the classic General Motors A-body mid-size trunk compartment, which is big. The beauty of these things is that you can put, 3-4 suitcases in there, or if you're going to the drive-in movies, you have 3 of your buddies stack up in there, you get in for free to the drive-in. But again, lots of room back there. And of course, under this hump right here is the rear axle. This is a rear-wheel drive car, obviously. The fuel tank is under the trunk floor, and the way you fill it is through the filler right there. Now, some American cars have the filler on either the left or the right-hand side, but most GM vehicles, it was in the middle. The difference is, if you don't have a good memory, like me, and you pull up to the gas pump and the filler's on that side, you go, you got to turn around. Well, when it's in the middle, you're always good. So that's one of the beauties of the GTO and the Chevelle and the Skylark, and of course the other GM intermediate cars. But again, this is a beautiful example of the breed. Nice clean trunk on this. And again, with each passing year, Pontiac did upgrade and change the styling a little bit. 1970 brought these sort of little dimples here over the rear and front wheel arches. more like a speed line, kind of like the 69 Camaro. You got to remember too that the styling departments that created these cars sometimes had intermingling of staff. So ideas would flow from left to right, up to down, from Pontiac to Chevrolet and vice versa. But again, that's the story of the 1970 Pontiac GTO, a popular year with 40,149 great ones built. And again, the party was going away. 71 saw 10, 11,000 made, and the dip was on as OPEC and environmentalism came in. And also just a lot of competition. I mean, there was a lot of other cars that would vie for your attention in 1970 if you wanted a muscle car. But this is one of the best. If you want to learn more about this car, check it out at the High Octane Classics website.